Today, I start the Colophons of the Marmaduke Pickthall translation. The opening, Al-Fataha, the opening are Fatahatul Kitab, the opening of the scripture are Quran, the essence of Al-Quran, as it is variously named, has been called the Lord's Prayer of the Muslimin. It is an essential part of all Muslim worship, public and private, and no solemn contract or transaction is complete unless it is recited. The date of revelation is uncertain, but the fact that it has always, from the earliest times, formed a part of Muslim worship, there being no record or remembrance of its introduction or of public prayer without it, makes it clear it was revealed before the 4th year of the Prophet's mission, the 10th year before the Hijrah. Because we know for certain that by that time regular congregational prayers were offered by the little group of Muslimin in Mecca, and that year as a result of insult and attack by the idolaters, different misassociators, not just the idol worshippers, but the Prophet arranged for their services, which had then been taken outdoors, to take place in a private house. The surah is often called Sab'an min al-Mathani, 7 of the often repeated verses, being understood from Surah 15:87, words which are taken as referring to this surah. And the translator uses the word Allah because it's a singular and definitive for God, and it makes clear that we're really talking about God rather than what people call God, so that's where that is. The cow, Al-Baqarah, is also named from the story of the yellow heifer, verse 67 and 61. When I went over the George Sale translation, he didn't want to translate the word yellow as yellow, because he thought it should be red. But a kind of weird thing, but this is the case with many other Suwar. The title is taken from some word or incident which surprised the listeners. All suggestions to the contrary notwithstanding, it seems probable the whole of this surah was revealed during the first 4 years after the Hijrah, and that by far the greater portion of it was revealed in the 18 months of the Prophet's reign at Medina, that is to say, before the Battle of Badr, the first 18 months. The Jewish tribes, once paramount in Yathrib, soon to become Medinat an-Nabi, had not very long before the coming of al-Islam been reduced by the polytheist Arab tribes of Aus and Khazraj, each Jewish tribe becoming an adherent of one or the other, but they had preserved a sort of intellectual ascendancy owing to their possession of the scripture and their fame for occult science, the Arabs consulting their rabbis on occasion and paying heed to what they said. Before the coming of al-Islam under Muhammad, it's not we're not saying that Islam started with Muhammad, but true religion leaves and then God sends a messenger to bring it back. You'll find that Bhagavad Gita 760 has that same message. These Jewish rabbis often told their neighbors that a prophet was about to come, and it often threatened them that when he came, the Jews, would destroy the Arabs, as the tribes of Ad and Thamud had been destroyed of old. Now, the Saudi tribe didn't exactly kill all the Jews, but they definitely, didn't kill all the rest of the Arabs, but they certainly did go after the Prophet's family and kind of take, the same tribe that the Prophet was part of, and took over a lot of Arabia. So plainly did they describe the coming of the coming prophet that pilgrims from Yathrib recognized the prophet when he addressed them in Mecca as the same whom the Jewish doctors had described to them. But the Jewish idea of a prophet was one who would give them dominion, not one who would make them brethren of every Arab who chose to accept al-Islam. When they found out that they could not make use of the newcomer, they opposed him and tried to bewilder him with questions from their theology, speaking to him as men who possessed superior wisdom, failing to perceive that, from a prophet's standpoint, theology, as in, just forming one's own opinion about spiritual matters, it's childish nonsense, the very opposite of religion and its enemy. Religion, for the prophet, not being a matter of conjecture and speech, but of fact and conduct. Philosophy rather than quoting philosophers, in other words. Because a lot of Jews will quote Talmud and stuff, but can they form these conclusions themselves? A lot of top Jews seem to have no wisdom, but they can quote things. Ibn Ishaq states definitely that verse 1 through 141 revealed concerning these Jewish rabbis, and such of the new converts to al-Islam as were half-hearted and inclined to them. There follows the order to change the Qibla, the place towards which the Muslimin turn their face in prayer, from Jerusalem to the Kaaba at Mecca, which is built by Abraham. The choice of Jerusalem having led to a misunderstanding on the part of the Jews that the prophet was groping his way toward their religion and stood in need of their guidance and instruction. All through this surah runs the note of warning which sounds indeed throughout the whole Quran, that it is not the mere profession of a creed, but righteous conduct, which is true religion. There is the repeated announcement, the religion of Abraham, to which Judaism and Christianity, Christianity is a polytheistic reworking of Judaism. There are polytheistic forms of Judaism, but you know what I mean. They make it into an actively Mithric faith. I don't think any type of Judaism, even the polytheistic ones, is Mithraic in that sort of way. Trace their origin. It is the only true religion. Islam by any other name is still Islam. And that religion consists in the surrender of man's will and purpose to the will and purpose of the Lord of creation, as manifested in his creation and revealed by way of guidance through successive prophets. Of sincerity in that religion, the one test is conduct. The standard of that religion is for all alike. At the time when the surah was revealed, and by reveal we can kind of mean learn too, but the prophet heard again and again and again until he learned the whole Quran. We hear that reference too. The prophet's own tribe, the Quraysh at Mecca, were preparing to attack the Muslimin at their place of refuge. Cruel persecution was the lot of Muslimin who had stayed in the Meccan territory or had journeyed thither, and the Muslimin were being prevented from performing the pilgrimage. The possible necessity of fighting had been foreseen in terms of the oath taken at Aqaba by the Muslimin of Yathrib before the flight, to defend the prophet as they would their own wives and children, and the first commandment of flight was revealed to the prophet before his flight from Mecca, but there was no actual fighting by the Muslimin until the Battle of Badr. Many of them were reluctant, having before been subject to a rule of strict nonviolence. It was with difficulty that they could accept the idea of fighting even in self-defense, as can be seen from several verses in this surah, which contain the rules for fasting and the pilgrimage, bequests, almsgiving, divorce, and contracts, verses which discountenance usury, strong drink, and gambling. It concludes with a statement of the universal character of al-Islam, the religion of Allah's sovereignty, and a prayer for forgiveness of shortcomings. This surah may be described as the Quran in little. It contains mention of all the essential points of the revelation, which are elaborated elsewhere. This accounts for the precedence given to it in the arrangement of the book, the period of Revelation is the years 1 and 2 Al-Hijra for the most part, certain verses of legislation being considered as of latter date. And a lot of that's been kind of undone, this idea that certain verses were only after this, because of this false doctrine of the Quran being abrogated, some part of the Quran being abrogated was, part of where that came from. But it turns out the verses of tolerance weren't continued to come in times where Muhammad had power to supposedly not be tolerant. Al-Imran takes its title from verse 32, where the family of Imran, the father of Moses, occurs as a generic name for all Hebrew people from Moses to John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. This is with the mention of the mother of Mary as the wife of Imran in the verse 34, and the words sister of Aaron addressed to Mary in 1928 have given rise to a charge of anachronism, absurd because the rest of the Quran is against it, by Muir and other non-Muslim writers who say that the Prophet confused Mary, the mother of Jesus, with Miriam, the sister of Moses. Most Muslims believe, on the authority of the Quran, that the grandfather of Jesus Christ was named Imran, which may also have been the name of the father of Moses. In Surah 19:28, where Mary's address as sister of Aaron they hold the ancestral sense to be the more probable, while denying that there is any reason to suppose that the Virgin Mary had not a brother named Aaron. Now, people get very confused when it comes to the Bible. The Gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, John was the earliest of them all. He was in the 90s. He wasn't writing in the 40s. He was writing in the 90s. The earliest rewrite of the text about Bacchus into what we call the Gospel of John occurred in the 90s. And then in the 120s, 130s, 140s, you have the other ones written. And they even contain internal evidence that points out that they did an investigation rather than they witnessed themselves. And things were supposed to be the case. And, the Gospels weren't written by eyewitnesses to what they were claiming. Second, third generation stuff there. So they confuse, one Mark versus another Mark, and another Matthew versus another Matthew. It's like, it's not all the same Matthew. They're the ones that did the confusion, so that's why they're pushing that off on others, right? If verse 1 through 32 were, as tradition states, revealed on occasion of the deputation from the Christians of Najran, which took place in the 10th year of the Hijrah, the year of deputations, as it is called, then they are of a much later date than the rest of the surah, but it seems possible that they were only recited by the Prophet on that occasion, having been revealed before. And we see evidences of that sort of thing, that some stuff was recited for occasions, but there's already evidence that it was taught, notably prior. Like Surah 12, there's parts of Surah 12 that was done with in 17 and 34. 3 verses there were recited that during the conquest of Mecca, but the evidence is that those verses just didn't appear at the conquest of Mecca. They were already in use. The Jews have become bolder and more bitter in opposition, which Nodeke points out could not have at this case after the signal victory of Badr until after the Muslims suffered a reverse at Uhud, a battle which verse 120 to 188 largely refer. Now, there's been a group of evil blue stripers, usually people with absolutely no religion, that are treating the Ramadan prayers as protest, and they're using this as an excuse to attack and evict people. And yes, we're calling, if the supplications, the going over the Quran, we don't have to mention the enemies. Whether it's something we're doing wrong ourselves or some external enemy, we don't have to mention them explicitly. It's all there. But let's not pretend that it's insurgency. The Muslims are praying at night. In the 3rd year of the Hijra, the Meccans came against Al-Madinah with an army of 3,000 men to avenge their defeat at Badr in the previous year and to wipe out the Muslimin. The Prophet, against his own first plan, which was to defend Al-Madinah at the instance of his companions, went out to meet them on Mount Uhud, posting his men carefully. He led an army of 1,000 men, a third of whom, under Abdullah ibn Ubay, the hypocrite leader, deserted him before the battle, and said afterward that they did not think that there would be any fighting that day. The battle began well for the Muslimin, but was changed into something near defeat by the disobedience of a band of 50 archers placed to guard a certain point. Seeing the Muslimin winning, they feared that they might lose their share of the spoils, and ran to join the others, leaving a way open for the Meccan cavalry. The polytheist then rallied and inflicted considerable loss upon the Muslimin, the Prophet himself being wounded in the struggle. A cry arose that the Prophet had been slain, and the Muslimin were in despair till someone recognized the Prophet and cried out that he was living. The Muslimin then rallied to his side and retired in some sort of order. The army of Quraysh also retired after the battle. In this battle, the wives of the leaders of the Quraysh, who had been brought with the army to give courage to by their presence and their chanting, mutilated the Muslim slain, making necklaces and bracelets of ears and noses. Hind, the wife of Abu Sufyan, plucked out the liver of the Prophet's uncle, Hamza, publicly and tried to eat it. The Prophet, when he saw the condition of the slain, was moved to vow reprisals, but he was relieved of his vow by revelation, and mutilation was forbidden to the Muslimin. Now, as opposed to what people think, that we're all a bunch of people cutting off heads and all that stuff. Even after death, we're not doing that. Now, if we got to cut, there's verses that talk about cutting on the cutting on the battlefield. In a fight, whatever goes is well, not whatever goes. We know what I mean. On the day after the battle of Mount Uhud, the Prophet again went out with such of the army as survived, in order that the Quraysh might hear that he was in the field, and happily be deterred from any project of attacking Al-Madinah in its weakened state. On that occasion, many wounded men went out with him. Tradition tells how a friendly nomad met the Muslimin and afterwards met the army of the Quraysh. Questioned by Abu Sufyan, he said that the Prophet was seeking vengeance with an overwhelming force, and that the report determined Abu Sufyan to march back to Mecca. The period of revelation is the 3rd and 4th years of the Hijra. And some say verse 61 was learned in regards to one of the deputations. But it's also important for us to note that in Islam, there's no concept of fighting people because they're disbelievers, because they're misassociators. By misassociators, I mean they attribute falsely to God partners, and they say that God is male or female or literally a father or something like that. There's no evidence in the Quran that anybody was fought for that. Now, the people who were fought weren't Muslim. Okay, but it wasn't because they weren't Muslim, It wasn't merely because they were not Muslim. Because they weren't Muslim, they were willing to attack the Muslimin and support wars against them and various things. But, But that chapter very clearly refutes fanaticism. That Muhammad being alive, Muhammad not being alive, you keep on the faith. And you could say that implies that if you know the teaching, you don't have to know of an example. You can follow the prophetic way without an explicit example of what you're going to do. An-Nisa, women, is so called because it deals largely with women's rights. The period of revelation is the months following the Battle of Uhud, or as Lodek, a careful critic puts it, between the end of the 3rd year at the end of the 5th year of the prophet's reign in Al-Madinah. As the surah contains no reference to the siege of Al-Madinah, the War of the Trench, by the allied tribes which took place in the 5th year, I should rather say between the end of the 3rd year and the beginning of the 5th year. Many Muslimin were killed at the Battle of Uhud, hence the concern for orphans and widows in the opening verses, which led on to a declaration of some rights of women of which they were deprived among the Arabs. And we'll see by looking at, a person can see by looking at Western laws, there's a lot of rights that Islam insists a woman has that Western countries don't. Like, consent is not as important for marriage of women, or their actual interest. These things are not as important to Western countries as they are in the Quran. The defection of the hypocrites, as the lukewarm or purely time-serving adherents were called, had been the chief cause of the reverse of Uhud, and after that reverse of some Jewish tribes, who had till then observed the letter of the treaty with the Prophet, became avowed supporters of the enemy, even going so far as to declare that the old Arab idolatry was preferable to al-Islam as a religion, and giving help and information to the Quraysh, so that in the end the Muslimin were obliged to make war on them. Both the hypocrites and the rebellious Jews are dealt with incidentally in this surah, the former at some length. There is a reference to Christian beliefs in 171, 172. The period of revelation is the 4th year of the Hijrah. Now, Khandaq and Khaybar were battles that we can all learn from. And these were not battles that they fought out of a result, because they were Jews. But it tells what to do with the aggressing armies and the warmongers that kind of aren't quite present themselves, but but chapter 4 also nails down the issue of people's female issues of one sort or another, whether it's projected into some sort of female that they worship, or whether it's outside the gender thing of the twists. It's not that the demiurgic twist upon the reality. So the demiurge meaning the devil, because demiurge means somebody who works something that is already there. So the implication that it isn't the creator, it's something else that presents itself as a creator. It presents something as creation or nature that isn't quite nature. So evil and ignorance is a twist upon good. It's a chief, you don't have to turn to the devil card of the tarot to get, the lessons from that. I think you find in every card in the Quran has a lesson for every one of those cards, although I'm not saying those cards existed at the time the Quran was learned, but initially, but it addresses those issues, just like in grimoires and other stuff. You're going to find everything big or small with some sort of spiritual guidance related to it in the Quran. Al-Ma'idah, the table spread, derives its name from verse 112. Okay, it has two V's and FF, and so that kind of threw me off for a second. Where it is told how the disciples of Jesus asked that a table spread with food might be sent down from heaven, and their prayer was granted, and a warning was given that if they turn away from right religion, then they will be condemned to the severest punishment. Many authorities regard it as the last surah in order of revelation, and Rodwell has so placed it in his chronological arrangement. But the claim can only be established in case of verse 3, which announces the completion of their religion for al-Muslimin, and the choice for them of al-Islam, the surrender of God as the religion. That verse, undoubtedly the latest of the whole Quran, it was revealed during the Prophet's last pilgrimage. Now, chapter 110 was the last chapter learned in full, by the way. as is called to Mecca, and spoken by him in the course of his address to the assembled thousands at Arafat, when all Arabia had embraced al-Islam only a little while before his death. It is possible that, as Noldick supposes, 2 other verses near to it are the same date, but the remainder of the revelations contained in this surah belong rather to that period between the 4th and 7th years al-Hijrah. Its subject is observance of religious duties. The followers of former prophets had failed through the breaking of their covenant, so that the Muslimin are adjured to keep their covenant with God and all their obligations watchfully, because God's covenant is only with those who do right. There is more mention of the Christians here than in the former Suwar, from which some writers infer that this surah must have been revealed at the time when the prophet was at war with certain Christian tribes belonging to the Eastern Roman Empire, but there is no evidence for that either in tradition or in the text itself. The period of revelation is between the 5th and 10th years of the Hijrah. And one of the things about this chapter that people try to say something like, okay, if an incident has a similar element, doesn't mean there weren't multiple incidences, and or that's some sort of confusion of the one incident that's being related. Oh, there's a table mentioned in this one, there's a table mentioned in the other. It's like, well, Eucharistos, a sort of real, a sort of more real experience than that, rather than just a projected thing was actually referred to, not the vision that's attributed to Peter. Al-Anam, the cattle, takes its name from the word in verse 137, repeated in verse 139 to 140, where cattle are mentioned in connection with superstitious practices condemned in al-Islam, with the possible exception of 9 verses, which some authorities Ibn Salama ascribed to the Medina period. The whole of this surah belongs to the year before the Hijrah. It is related on the authority of Ibn Abbas that it was revealed in a single visitation. It is placed here on account of the subject, vindication of the divine unity, which fitly follows on the subjects of the previous Suwar. A note of certain triumph is remarkable in the circumstances of its revelation, which the Prophet, after 13 years of effort, saw himself obliged to flee from Mecca and seek help from strangers. It's a late Meccan surah, in chapter 7.